Building a conservatism for the young. The Tories' struggle to appeal to young voters has been a particularly thorny issue for the party. After all, the average age of a Conservative voter, as we found out earlier this year, is 63. Perhaps this isn't surprising. Young people have had it fairly rough over the last 14 years. Only 28% of those aged 25 to 34 own their own home. This is down from 51% in 1989, a huge drop. There has also been an 11% increase in the share of the national wealth among over 55 since the 2008 financial crash, and it has decreased for those under it. Forging an agenda to fix this is going to be vital for the Conservatives' future political prospects. To talk about this, we have an excellent panel. Katie Lamb, to my left, is the MP for the Weald of Kent. Sam Bidwell is the director of the Next Generation Centre. Ruth Marvel is the CEO of the Duke of Edinburgh Award Scheme, and Reem Ibrahim is the acting director of comms at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Each panellist will have a small amount of time to give an opening statement. Then we'll have a little chat up here, and after that we'll throw it to the floor for questions. So, Katie, with no further ado, we'll kick off with you.
Great, thank you very much. So it will not shock, I wouldn't have thought anybody here to hear that pretty much the only people who were willing to stick with us this past election were the older generation. We just heard that the average voter is now 63. The average age at which you're now more likely to vote Conservative than Labour is 64. In 2019, that was 39. In 2015, that was 35. So, you know, that is a big shift. I think it's easy to say, and we often say, oh, well, you know, we've never had sort of huge polling numbers with young people, but that really has changed quite dramatically. And at the general election this year, for 18 to 35-year-olds, we polled below all of our main competition. So Labour, obviously, we kind of know that, but below the Lib Dems, below the Greens, and below Reform. Amongst 13 to 44-year-olds, we polled about 17%, Reform just behind us on 14, and the Lib Dems on 13. So the situation is very challenging, and it's really sad to see those kinds of numbers. 60% of young people feel disconnected from politics. This is mostly due to general disillusionment about delivery and change, this idea that whoever you vote for, nothing really happens. And that's not different from the general public. You know, one of the things that I will probably mention a couple of times today is that young people are not a kind of niche audience. A lot of the things that young people want and that are important to young people are just the things that people want and that are important to all people. Younger people are also going to need to see an exciting future where their aspiration is rewarded. You know, this is a central Conservative value. And for that, we are going to need some economic growth. That is also not a niche concern. You know, all of us are going to need to see some economic growth. There are perhaps some policy areas that are a little bit more specific. We're going to talk in due course, I think, about homes and about families. But in general, things that are good for young people are good for the country. And so many of those are very firmly aligned with what we as Conservatives do and should believe. The other point that I just wanted to make before we move on is that I believe to win back and win over young people, we will need a clearer, more moral mission. Much is made of millennials and especially of kind of Gen Z of being very sensitive. You know, this can be mocked in the sort of snowflake archetype. But actually, I think it's really admirable to care about something bigger than yourself. And we should have an ideological point of view on the world. There should be things that we believe. And I think our pitch needs to be less managerial, less technocratic, and much more moral and inspiring. You know, if we're making the case for a smaller state, that needs to be about quality, that things work, that at this kind of size of government they never will. You know, it's not just about saving money or lowering taxes. Obviously, I also believe it's a moral good to lower taxes and give people their own money to spend. But I think for younger people, because we're also not talking that young, you know, it's a sort of sub 50, but certainly sub 40, 45, I think there has to be something about the moral mission of providing a higher quality of life and a better future rather than just discussions about cash.
Fantastic. Sam?
Great. Thanks very much for having me. I'm speaking on about 4 or 5 of these panels on similar subjects across this conference, which is great because this is an extinction-level existential threat for the Conservative Party. But in the interest of preserving my own sanity, I've banned myself from talking too much about the housing crisis. Because if I just talk about the housing crisis, we'll be here all day. You've all heard it all before. This is now the sine qua non of young Conservative politics. It's getting planning fixed in order to increase the number of houses that we build, in order to bring housing costs down. I think we're going to hear more about that from Reem later on, so I'll leave her to it. But I think actually housing is a symptom of a deeper problem in the way that we've regarded the economy for the last 30 years as a country, and certainly for the last 14 years as a Conservative Party, which is that our approach to government and the economy has shifted from one in which we see government as an enabler, which encourages people to be freewheeling, enterprising, innovative, to a system of government and an approach to government which says the job of government is to eliminate risk and to eliminate negative externality. That cuts right across all of these different problems, maladies that we all point to. The growth of regulators from 25 to 95 since 1997, the growth in HR, the growth in legal compliance, the growth in all of these growth constricting elements of our economic system at the moment. And indeed, it's the core problem with our planning system. We try and eliminate negative externality for existing asset owners by preventing the building of new houses. So it's all about getting rid of risk. And the problem there is you create an economic system in which people are not incentivized to be conservative, to believe in conservative ideas like enterprise and innovation and aspiration. Because now if you look at how people are earning their money, you take people earning a state pension, or rather receiving a state pension, you take people who are directly employed in the public sector and you take those who are involved in the private sector, but areas of the private sector that are downstream of public sector regulations, so legal compliance, HR, etc. You end up with a big chunk of the country, probably a majority, which owes its livelihood to the state. And so in this sense, young people are conservative, but they're conservative for a kind of managerialist centre-left system. Let's be clear, most young people are not left-wing radicals. They are passively centre-left. They go along with the flow. They're happy with the economic model that we've got, or at least they're content to continue supporting that party. They broadly like the ideas of the Labour Party. They think that equality is a nice idea. They think that maybe we should actually stop these bad things happening. What we've been very poor at is articulating not only that we do have an alternative model, but that it is an alternative model, that what we have now is not a proper market. It is not an economic system which rewards innovation and aspiration and growth. It is an economic system which tries to eliminate all risk. We need to get back, in my view, to embracing risk. The biggest beneficiaries of that will be young people who are and have always been the freewheelers. They have always been those who get out, start their own businesses, innovate. They're the growth group, the growth generation. If we can get back onto that train of embracing the benefits of risk, I think we'll be a lot closer to winning over young people, and housing is part of it, but it's not the only part of it.
Thanks, Sam. Ruth?
Thanks very much. So I guess we work with about 550,000 young people every year through the DV. And I think it's probably fair to say that uncertainty sort of feels like the word of the day. Young people have been facing a kind of perfect storm of challenges over the past few years. And when we talked to them, we did some research just before the election with a representative sample of young people, and this sort of sense of kind of uncertainty, anxiety. How are young people going to navigate this, not only this incredibly challenging sort of transition from childhood into adulthood, but also I think running into some of these sort of economic and kind of personal challenges, both domestically and kind of on a global stage. So whether you look at it from the lens of sort of climate change and, global instability, growing kind of inequality and poverty and cost of living crisis, the challenges that kind of are coming down the track in terms of AI and technology and the way it's going to change the world of work, or just the sort of day-to-day growing pains of kind of working out how you're going to get through adolescence and sort of through your education and into a job, and hopefully be able to move out of your parents' house at some point. I think this sense of I think all political parties need to really kind of understand just the level of kind of sort of almost existential anxiety that kind of I think young people are experiencing at the moment. Interestingly, the sort of research that we did showed that young people are feeling really sort of unprepared for kind of adulthood, probably more so than ever before. I think there's lots of discussion around, has the social contract been broken? Have the milestones and the kind of the key points in life that perhaps previous generations have kind of taken for granted, that you'd be able to move out of your parents' house, you'd be able to get a job that fitted your skills and talents, you'd be able to find a partner if you wanted one and kind of settle down, have a family, you'd be able to retire. All of those things feel much more uncertain, much less sort of guaranteed. And there's something there, I think, around politicians kind of understanding this anxiety and thinking about what is it that government needs to do, along with kind of other institutions and the sort of social fabric, to help sort of young people navigate this anxiety. Certainly the research that we did said, young people were calling out very clearly for sort of more support to be able to navigate these challenges. And you're seeing interesting, I guess, sort of cultural changes in terms of young people's attitudes. There's been some stuff in the media this week around conscious unbossing, which I particularly like the title of. But young people are increasingly saying they don't want to take on managerial roles. They're too high stress, they're too low reward. And actually, interestingly, to the point on entrepreneurialism, kind of more interested in being their own boss. I think one of the things that we at Duke of Edinburgh's Award are really focused on is around how do we help young people develop themselves? How do you develop the confidence, the resilience, the self-belief, the independence that you're going to need in order to kind of navigate adulthood successfully? And we see how, what young people can do when you give them those opportunities. I think we have a lot of experience, I guess, of watching a kind of increasingly sort of narrow academic school system, which is kind of squeezing out opportunities for young people to learn by experience. How do you learn to lead a team? How do you learn to, look after yourself if you're not given those opportunities? How do you learn to rely on your peers? How do you learn to sort of pick yourself up and give it another go if it all goes wrong, if you never actually have those experiences? So I think the other really important message that certainly came out of our research was the young people are deeply, deeply engaged and passionate about the big issues of the world today, but they are very disillusioned with politics and politicians. So there is a mountain to climb in terms of that. How do you re-engage young people? How do you convince young people that politicians sort of can be trusted, I guess, to help them and to kind of, make decisions that are in their best interests?
Fantastic. And Reem?
Thank you, Joe, and thank you to CapX for introducing this very, very interesting topic and very, very important one. There is an old adage that is often falsely attributed to Churchill: if you're not a liberal when you're 18, you have no heart. And if you're not a conservative by the time you're 30, you have no brain. Now, that generational shift is no longer happening. So we know that, as Katie very eloquently pointed out, the age at which people are becoming conservatives is getting later and later in their lives. Now, that is fundamentally an economic problem. I have three very small points that I would like to outline here at the moment. As Sam mentioned, I am going to talk a little bit about housing, because we cannot talk about young people and the economy, and indeed the way in which the young people will have to engage with the Conservative Party, without talking about housing. So, as Katie's already mentioned, we know that housing is getting ever more expensive, and we also know that the cultural implications of that are that young people are less likely to own a home and less likely to start a family, and therefore less likely to become conservative. So if we fix the housing crisis, then we will ultimately fix the fact that young people are not then becoming conservatives. Fundamentally, at its core, this is about fixing the planning system. And we also know that 14 years of Conservative governments have presided over the active restriction of house building. So we have to ensure that those political incentives are solved at the first point. So housing is very, very important. I also want to make the point that actually worklessness seems to be increasing as a result of the government's intervention with regard to long-term sickness benefits. So there are some quite shocking statistics here. In 2021 to 2022, just over 63,000 people went from being economically inactive because they were students to then being economically inactive because they were on long-term sickness benefits. How can somebody go from being in full-time education to then being on long-term sickness benefits? Something is clearly not working here. There are now just below 3 million people on long-term sickness benefits, and the cost of long-term sickness benefits is expected to increase to £64 billion by the end of this Parliament. There is something fundamentally wrong with the benefit system, and young people are clearly bearing the brunt of that. There are hundreds of thousands of young people that are now clearly going on to long-term sickness benefits, much of which, by the way, is as a result of relaxation around the rules during the pandemic as a result of mental health. Now, let's be very clear, there is absolutely no evidence that a young person that is clinically depressed, that the best thing for them is to be sitting at home on long-term sickness benefits. Now, there are 2 points here. It is not only a waste of taxpayer money for those particular people to be sat at home doing absolutely nothing whilst other hardworking taxpayers are paying for them, but it is also a huge, huge waste of human potential. These are young people that could be contributing to society, that could feel as though they are dignified by work, that aren't. And fundamentally, it's as a result of the broken benefit system. Third and final point, the government, during the Conservative time the government have presided over, effectively this kind of infantilisation of young people. So the generational tobacco ban, I think, is a very, very good example of this, where the government that was presided over by the Conservative Party have effectively said to young people and the adults of the future that we are going to treat you as though you are children forever. Now, I think that that is incredibly unfair. It is not only fundamentally illiberal, but it is also fundamentally unconservative. We need to ensure that the Conservative Party, if it is to do something, and if it is to try and cater towards young people, it is looking towards a society in which free enterprise, personal responsibility, and ultimately individual liberty is at the heart and soul of the party. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Really interesting points there. There's a lot to dig into. Katie, not only are you a Tory MP, you're a younger Tory MP.
Yes, it's true. I can't deny it.
The lesser seen. But so that gives you quite a unique perspective on this issue. And I was wondering, as you see it, what do you think is sort of fundamentally the biggest factor driving young voters away from Toryism? Is it an issue of messaging? Or is it an issue of policy? What is it?
So I think it is a marriage of, well, I'd say the two probably main tracks that we've been talking about here, and I sort of alluded to a couple of these earlier. One, I think, is kind of the economy stupid. You know, I think it is just so difficult now for young people to see an aspirational, exciting future in which they have capital to protect, be that the financial capital of earning money and owning your own home and your own car or whatever it might be, and the social capital of being able to have a family and live in the way that you would want to and have a partner, and some of the things that Ruth was talking about. I think that's one thing. And then I do think that the other thing is that some of the messaging from the Conservatives has become, I almost want to say sort of drier, but less mission-based, what I was talking about earlier. You know, I just don't think that it has been recently as compelling a vision of the future, of what is exciting, of what is, you know, what Ruth was saying about young people feeling very anxious, and I think it also ties into what Reem was saying about being on long-term sick, is the world, and actually also what Sam was saying about risk, is the world is an inherently uncertain and risky place, and what we all need to be able to help young people to do is to see that as the exciting opportunity that it is, not the overwhelming threat that they are currently experiencing it as. And I think I totally agree with what was said about the fact that, you know, the government and including, I'm afraid, Conservative governments haven't really played their role in that, because instead they have said we can mitigate all risk. COVID, of course, was disastrous for this, when it was like, oh, well, the government can't do anything, can't do everything. Okay, well, maybe it can. And some of that was kind of unavoidable. You know, it was just a really terrible situation. But I do think that has now led to this feeling that, you know, the uncertainty of the future should be the most exciting thing that gets all of us out of bed in the morning. And the fact that is giving young people crippling anxiety, I do think is partly the fault of governments, making it seem like you shouldn't feel that way, and you should. And that should be the indication that something exciting is about to happen.
Yeah, no, we definitely need a reason to be cheerful. I suppose if that's not provided, you're in a difficult spot. Sam, you talked about the politics and the economics of risk aversion as sort of entrenching this kind of low growth economic stagnation that affects young people so sharply. Do you think there are any policy areas in particular where this is seen most acutely?
Yeah, so look, there's a practical manifestation and then there's a cultural manifestation. So practically it has to be planning. It has to be a planning system in which we say, any negative harm, any negative externality, any second order consequence that might arise is absolutely not worth it. We see this is what drives up the cost of infrastructure. It's why it's expensive to build, nuclear power plants. It's why it's expensive to build high-speed rail. It's also why we don't build houses. The inability to build. I'm sure most people in the room have read the Foundation's essay that came out the other day, right? Great piece of work. Read it if you haven't. The core point of that essay is, the source of, or one of the sources of our low growth and of our expensive energy, which are two issues intimately tied together, is that we can't build anything. And the reason we can't build anything is because we say to people who own land, property, assets, nothing will ever go wrong for you. It is the only class of investment in which we guarantee people, rhetorically, that your asset will never lose value. And in fact, it will always tick up. Right? If I invest a little in the stock market, if somebody turned around to me and said, well, we're going to have a stocks and shares system in which your stock will always appreciate, and anything which could bring the cost of that stock down, the government will step in, intervene, stop it. You'd all go, that's ridiculous. So we ought not to be doing that on assets either. I think the most harmful manifestation is the cultural one. And I think this is absolutely linked to the points on mental health, on anxiety, on uncertainty. If your experience of government is the government exists to protect me from harm, to talk me through discomfort, to support me financially through difficulty, of course you don't have the opportunity to develop the enthusiasm for risk, the personal resilience that turns people into conservatives. Yes, it's about capital protection, but the Conservative Party has always been a marriage between conservative ideas, capital protection, protection of one's own personal property, and liberal ideas about growth and innovation and progress and the future. And unfortunately, I think many in the party have remembered the former, but not remembered the latter. And we work best when we marry the two together.
That's interesting stuff. Ruth, you talked about a kind of pervasive feeling of existential angst among young people, which is something that's afflicted them for, basically as long as time. But it does feel particularly sort of acute at the moment. The Tories proposed sort of reintroducing a form of national service to try and equip people sort of with the skills and confidence perhaps then to go and enter the labour market. Now that policy was met with, I think it's fair to say, mixed opinion. Was it actually a good idea? What sort of a scheme would you propose to boost young people's confidence in going to the world?
Well, I think the short answer is the Duke of Edinburgh's Award, but the government introduced a form of national service in 2010. It's called the National Citizen Service, and they seem to have forgotten at the time when they announced this that they already had one. I think what Duke of Edinburgh does is it provides a framework through which young people can develop themselves. And it's really fundamental and really important. I think one of the challenges with any kind of one-size-fits-all programme is that young people are not kind of all one size. And you need a diversity of different things which are going to engage young people, they're going to feel enthusiastic and passionate about. The original national service kind of policy was dropped because it was incredibly expensive. So I think from a kind of, if you look at kind of the costings of the most recent national service proposal, you could invest that in community youth work and get, I think, a lot more bang for your buck. But yeah, I think the serious point around kind of how do we, what are our sort of rites of passage for young people? I was talking to a youth worker a little while ago, and he sort of talked about the fact that actually these kind of important moments in young people's lives, like the moment that you leave home, are kind of increasingly sort of disappearing. And he talked about the struggle of kind of how do you prepare and support young people if actually some of these kind of big life milestones actually just don't happen, or are just sort of a bit fuzzy. And so that sense of like how do you equip young people for the kind of the future, for risk, for having to be independent and make your own decisions and things going a bit wrong, I think is really important. And we've ended up, I think, in terms of a focus on academic performance in school, which, as I said before, has sort of squeezed out a lot of the opportunities for young people to kind of learn about life and develop the kinds of life skills that they need, which employers are crying out for. Almost all the stories, I think, that you read around sort of Gen Z in the workplace are kind of linked to, you know, young people don't have part-time jobs in the way they used to. Where is that experiential learning coming from? It's all very well to have great grades at GCSE, you know, but if you haven't got any sort of common sense, then, you know, it is quite difficult to kind of exist in the world. I think the point about risk is really interesting as well, because I think sometimes, as you said at the beginning, Joe, we can be a bit down on young people in this sort of anxiety. But we live in an increasingly risk-averse world, and now we have access to information at our fingertips about absolutely everything. We are living in a culture now where taking risks is stupid a lot of the time, because you have information that you could have used. And I think we have to sort of take a step back and think this isn't just a generational issue. We're creating this culture. It's not just something that young people haven't just changed. Increasingly, the world in which we live doesn't accept risk. I was talking to someone last week who, a sort of head teacher, who said, well, if you tried to invent sort of like D&V now, you probably wouldn't be allowed to. You know, because some of the things we do and the activities that, you know, young people participate in are inherently risky. And I think that's an interesting question for government generally. We obviously, you know, we don't want bad things to happen to people, and people don't want bad things to happen to them, and parents don't want bad things to happen to their children. But in a world where you can predict everything, and increasingly with AI, you probably can predict even more, I think there's an interesting just social conundrum for us around, because we are teaching young people that taking risks is dangerous. And I think, you know, we at D&V are probably trying to continue to give young people some of that freedom, essentially, to make mistakes and to... but I do see the kind of the shift in tone that comes, that you know, increasingly, that, you know, you run up against that, I think, a little bit. And I don't know what the solution to that is in terms of government policy, but I think it's an interesting environment in which we're
hugely important
living.
To desensitise young people to risk. Reem, you talked about the kind of infantilising attitude that the Tories were perceived to have taken towards, I don't know, people's lifestyle habits. So the generational tobacco ban, the ban on single-use vapes, that kind of stuff. How corrosive do you think that this perceived attitude of nanny knows best for young people was in driving them away from the Tories' offering?
Yeah, I don't necessarily think it had a huge impact on young people in terms of them actually voting Conservative. If they were driven away by the fact that disposable vapes are possibly going to be banned, then I think they probably weren't very strong Conservative voters in the first place. I think this does go back to the kind of risk-averse nature. This is why I actually really hate the term nanny state, because nanny sounds really nice and cuddly, and you see Wes Streeting sort of saying things like, well, actually, I don't mind being nanny. No, this is the fun police. These are effectively government policies that tell people what they can and cannot do with their own lives and with their own bodies. Now, again, this goes back to the point about risk aversion. It is not the government's job, or it should not be the government's job, to protect you from these harms. We all know that smoking is bad for us. It's on all of the packaging. If you can read, you know. We all know that vaping is also not that great for you, although it is more than 95% less harmful than cigarettes. I think disposable vapes is a really good example of that, where there is absolutely no evidence for this policy whatsoever. So we know that there are double the number of 11 to 17-year-olds that drink alcohol regularly than vape regularly. However, nobody is seriously considering banning alcohol for everyone because a proportion of people that are already banned from buying it manage to get their hands on it. It's an issue of enforcement, isn't it? It's an issue of the fact that policing isn't working and we actually have to crack down on those illegal products before we're even able to tackle anything else. I also think just on that point about how this actually brings away from young people, effectively the government saying things like, we know better than you, is incredibly insulting and speaks to a matter of cultural perception where actually the government is saying that they know better than young people and that even the adults of the future cannot decide for themselves how they live their lives. I think it is illiberal, I think it is wrong, it is not based on any evidence, and crucially, it is fundamentally unconservative. How can we expect young people to believe in personal responsibility when the Conservative governments of the last 14 years haven't even believed it themselves?
Very important stuff. We'll open up to the floor now for any questions. My colleague will come around with a roving mic. Dylan, if we could start off with that chap over there in the navy blue shirt.
Pensions auto-enrolment was a fantastic opportunity to get young people involved in capitalism, start building a property-owning democracy. But one of the big problems with it is most pension funds, by default, when you've auto-enrolled, they shove all of your money into really safe, low-risk assets which aren't going to get you any return over the long run. How can we get more young people passionate about pensions, passionate about investments, and become the capitalists of the future?
Katie, getting young people engaged in capitalism.
So I agree with you, and it's particularly sad given that the way that you can really make money from your pension is having a very long time frame, right? Like the further away your need for cash drawdown is, the higher your risk appetite should be. So it also means not only will we not be getting these people interested in capitalism, we will be allowing them to be poorer than they otherwise would have been by investing in equities or investing in private equity or other much higher rate of return assets. We don't really in this country, we've never, well, we certainly, at least in the last few years, haven't had much of a culture of personal investing in that kind of a way. And not least because, as Sam was so articulately talking about earlier, we've had so much more protection for housing, right? So if you had a lump sum of money, you would be better off buying, a buy-to-let flat and drawing a cash flow from that. Now, because of how mortgage rates have changed, that's all slightly changed. But I think there's two parts to your question. How do we make it easier to invest pension money in higher risk assets? And how do we get young people interested in doing that? I think on the first one, there are various rules around pension and capital risk that need to be relaxed. I mean, it's sort of, that bit's actually not about young people, but it comes back to the same point about risk, right? Allowing people to put their money at risk, particularly when they've got 30, 40, 50 years until they need to get it back. And then I think in a slight chicken and egg way, the best way to get young people interested in that is for them to do it a little bit and for them to watch their money grow. That is very exciting, the idea that you can invest in things, choose things. I hope that there will be some sort of private sector platforms that slightly fill that gap, because I do think it's a big market opportunity, but we'll need to ease the regulations first to allow them to do that.
Fantastic. And her just there in front of you, Dylan.
Yeah, so my question is about the personal incentives for our MPs and councillors. I was a candidate in the last election, and two easy rules in the campaign were we do not set foot on new build housing estates because they hate us. We obviously have to oppose any infrastructure project here because while it's good for the country, it's the kiss of death to actually support it in your own constituency. So while I think lots of us agree with this in general, how do we help our parties, representatives, MPs, councillors, actually walk the walk in their own patches to make this a reality?
What do you think would make politicians less risk-averse, Sam?
It's a really good question. Look, I think to some extent it's a question of the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. There has to be a bit of bravery and leadership on this question. Unfortunately, politics is about trade-offs. I'd be interested to hear from the elected official on the panel, actually, after I said a few words. But I absolutely think, look, it has to come from a position of leadership and bravery. Somebody's got to be willing to make trade-offs here and there. We've actually seen, the Labour government, for its many sins thus far, has been pretty good at pushing certain projects through where it's wanted to, right? Governments, when they want to push these projects through, can. Short of a kind of electoral commission fine for anybody who intervenes on a planning case in their own constituency, which, in a utopia perhaps I would impose, but is probably not viable. It is unfortunately going to have to come from a consensus understanding within the Conservative Party, which says if the country does not grow, if the economy does not grow, we all lose our seats. So, maybe one or two people will lose seats, and this is very unfortunate for them in a situation where we back infrastructure, we back building, we back house building. As we've seen at the last election, when the economy isn't very good, lots more Conservatives lose their seats in the round. So yes, in the short-term incentive sense, you absolutely have an incentive as an individual MP to oppose house building. But in the aggregate, if we all put up those additional barriers to growth, then the party loses, the party gets kicked out, as we've just seen.
So my view on this is that issue is effectively a distillation of the wider issue, which is the incentives of citizens are not aligned to support this, right? And I think the best way to do that is to have, I don't want to say sort of if in doubt, bribe the public, but if you are going to have a new solar farm in your area, we'll pay your bills first. All of your bills are 90% off, and then the power goes out to everywhere else. Or if we are going to have a new housing estate, whatever percentage still makes it profitable goes to the local community, or even goes straight to individuals. I don't know if you're there's a program called Create Streets that does a lot of work on this, specifically in the housing space, about incentivizing hyper-locally people to actually support this kind of development. Because whilst that is a massive problem, you're always going to have that in a democracy, and you're much better off solving the underlying problem, which is it is not in individual people's interests to have people build where they live. So whatever you can do to fix that problem will naturally solve your democratic problem.
Any more questions? That chap just over there in the specs and the green jacket.
Hi, thank you for your talks. So this is obviously a really important, even existential issue for the party. Yet I note that there's a smattering of attendees here. There seems like an air of unreality to the conference today, in that we're all busy focusing on all kinds of issues as though we're the natural party of government, which hopefully we are. But if we don't get the young back in, then there's a problem. The party will disappear. How do we actually really enthuse the party itself to really grapple with this problem, to give it that energy and total focus to make us win back the youth?
Reem, what do you think?
I think we need some conviction. I think we need people in the party to actually look in the mirror and realise that there is this existential threat. And you're absolutely right. The fact of the matter is the Conservative government over the last few years haven't solved this problem. And actually, if we look at the policies that were announced in the lead up to the general election this summer, we saw that the government effectively went straight back to the core voter base. Triple lock plus. So pensioners, 25% of them already are millionaires. We know that we already spend huge amounts of money on pensions. By the way, more than double the entire budget of the Ministry of Defence goes on pensions alone. Wow. At the same time, we saw things like national service, which of course were voluntary, not voluntary national service being floated around as well. Trying to go back to those core voters that the Conservative Party have relied on for far, far too long. Now again, we see this in the short term. This is partly the nature of the electoral cycle. It's the nature of politics. And I am in a very lucky position that I don't have an electorate to answer to, so I can speak very freely about this. I think that NIMBYs are evil, and I don't think that we should listen to them. And I think that every member of parliament should stand up to them and effectively argue that this is not the case at all. Slightly more serious point, I think when you look across the world, one of the best ways to actually incentivise local governments to build more is to decentralise the fiscal system. So if you look at places like Madrid, for example, where effectively local authorities are responsible for raising their own revenue, raising their own tax revenue, they are going to want more taxpayers in their jurisdiction, and therefore they are going to be incentivised to build more homes. So there are ways that we can sort of adapt and reform the fiscal system in order to encourage house building. So there are ways that we can do that, and Katie, I think, outlined some other ways that we can do that as well, actually giving some of that financial incentive back to the people that live there already. These are all great, but I think we have to be very, very clear about this. If you are actively blocking building in this country, you are the problem.
Just briefly. I'm actually very bullish on the party in this respect. So this is my 7th conference, Talk About a Misspent Youth. And this is the most attention I've seen on this issue at any conference I've been to thus far. The main reason that I'm optimistic, though, is I think we're settling as a party on a number of the things we need to be doing anyway, even if we're not doing it for the kind of young people reason. So the building agenda, which 5 years ago was not where the party is now, and we've come a long way in terms of the conversations we're having about planning and infrastructure and energy costs. These are all things which will benefit young people, in my view, disproportionately, because they're the ones coming into the workforce, they're the ones taking risk, they're the ones who need to accrue capital over their lives. Their lives will be improved hugely when we once again have a growing economy where you can build things and where energy is reasonably inexpensive. We haven't reached there because of chest beating about young people, as much as I'd like it if we had, but we have reached it for other reasons. And if we can get that agenda right, we go 90% of the way there in terms of rejigging the brand amongst young people.
And Ruth, you might have an interesting perspective on this. What issues have you found are at the forefront of young people's mind? What kind of stuff could the Tories be talking about a bit more to enthuse them?
Well, I mean, the research that we did showed 4 kind of issues that sort of sat in the sweet spot, I guess, of the Venn diagram between personal and political. And perhaps unsurprisingly, they're cost of living, mental health, affordable housing, and interestingly, getting a job I enjoy, not just a job, but this sense of purpose, again, came to be very strongly from young people. They want something that, they want to do something with their lives that is meaningful, and they want to do something that kind of makes the most of their skills and talents. So those 4 areas were the ones that kind of came in both, those were both things that young people were really concerned about personally, but also politically. Then you had, actually, as you might expect, education, kind of money, cost of living, family, exams were kind of very much front of mind from a personal point of view. But in political terms, I mean, the NHS, immigration, climate change, the economy, homelessness were kind of all top issues. So quite a broad range of things. I think, young people are definitely engaged in these issues. But that kind of disconnection with sort of, I think, politicians and the idea that, politicians are listening to young people. I suppose so one reflection on this conversation is there's been quite, and this has been quite a strong theme across this conference, that the question of how can the Conservatives get young people to be more conservative? Perhaps you could flip on its head and go, how can the Conservatives kind of take action on the issues that young people care about?
It's interesting. We'll take another question. This chap just here. Thanks, Dylan.
Just to pick up on what Ruth was saying, I was in an event yesterday where a speaker was saying that the Conservative Party hasn't really been speaking to young people or attracted them since the time of David Cameron, because he presented a message of caring conservatism. And to pick up what Ruth was saying about purpose and personal, does the panel feel that we need to have a message of caring conservatism, not just more hard-nosed policies?
What does that mean? What does caring conservatism mean, I think, is sort of the point there. I mean, David Cameron presided over, quite a large state. I mean, austerity didn't really happen. We saw reduction in public spending by about 0.9% each year. I suppose the question is, what does caring mean? I think that the most benevolent thing that we can do for anybody is ensure that they are able to take personal responsibility, both financially and emotionally, for themselves. I don't think it's particularly caring for us to allow tens of thousands of young people to remain on long-term sickness benefits and not contribute to anything. I don't think that's particularly caring. I think what we need is a bit of tough love and a bit of a sort of look in the mirror and actual realisation that the state is actively incentivising young young people to not contribute, and actually that probably is having an impact on their mental health, and that is having an impact on their perspective on how much they are contributing to the economy and ultimately contributing to society. So I think it depends on what we mean by caring. I think the most caring thing we can do for young people is to get them back into work and get them contributing and ultimately on the housing ladder.
Ruth, when you talk to young people about the Conservatives, is the first word that comes to their mind compassion and caring?
I mean, we're not a party political organisation, so we don't talk to young people about specific political parties. But, I mean, I think the central message, I think, certainly from young people was that in terms of the research that we did pre-election, where we were interested in, hopes and fears and kind of what do they want from the next government. And I think sort of first and foremost, they want a government that listens. They want a government that's engaged with and wants to understand the challenges they face and wants to work with them to create solutions. So I think that was the sort of the definite call, was that young people are, feel very, I think, informed and capable, and are often feel kind of they are, patronised and ignored. They feel very much that being under 18 is essentially makes you invisible. Kind of in the electoral system, but the sense that kind of, they have something to contribute in terms of solutions, not just, we'll sit back and wait for the government to solve our problems for us. They wanted to be kind of engaged, and they wanted better ways of contributing to the sort of national conversation about, where is the world going?
Take another question. Just this chap here in front of you, Dylan.
Hi, thank you. So for many, many years, since I was 18, actually not that many years,
3.
Yeah, just a couple. Most of my friends and my social group are on the left. And as I've seen them over the years buy flats and actually do well in their career and aspire to do better, if I were to mention to them, you know what, you're actually Conservatives, they have aneurysms. I mean, they actually think it's the worst thing I could have said to them. If I tell them they're Thatcherite, they drop dead. So how do you make younger people actually realise that the aspirations they have were once owned by the Conservatives and detoxify the brand?
Katie.
Well, my answer to this question, it's sort of actually aligned to my answer with my answer to the last question, which is I do think it comes back to this idea of moral mission and a purpose. And I think that what we want to see, what I think young people want to see, but because I think what all people want to see is politicians or a party, in the case of the Conservatives, your question is specifically about the brand of the party, that care about moral good, that want people to do well, that where it matters to them, people's success and happiness and the future of them as individuals, as families, of the country, all of that kind of thing. So I think detoxifying the brand is perhaps sort of adjacent to this question about caring. It doesn't have to be cuddly, but I do think that we need to believe that our politicians in general, and specifically, because that's what we're talking about, the politicians of the Conservative Party, want good things for us, and to agree with them is also good. They want things that are morally good, and therefore, if we want what they want, we can be morally good too. I think that those two things go hand in hand.
So.
Yeah, I mean, look, we've traditionally actually been quite good at painting, certainly market economics, as a moral or just force. And this is, I think, something we've stopped doing. So if you look at thinkers like Friedrich Hayek, who articulated beautifully why a market system, a free economy, a free society is more moral, more just, both for the individual and in terms of the effects it produces. Traditionally, that's something we've been very good at as a party. People like Margaret Thatcher, very famously, big Hayekian, was able to make these moral arguments to say, actually, not only does this system afford you more personal dignity, it also provides us a more even, a more equitable playing field. I deal with you as an equal, not through power relationships or not through class or through labels and this kind of thing. We've lost that moral dimension to politics. It is far too instrumental. And what that allows is it allows people to dislocate their political views from their own economic success, which is what you're talking about there. There are lots of people who've done very well out of the current system who go, yeah, I'm going to go along and vote for the centre-left, more regulation, anti-risk attitude every time because I've dislocated these two things. What we need to make the point to people is that a moral, just philosophy of free societies, free markets, links up to your personal prosperity, and you should want both, and you can have both.
I also think the Labour government may make that point for us, because I think that there will be people, and your friends may end up in this category, who have voted in the general election and are going to get a real shock when they realise that by tax the rich, they meant them. That's who they're talking about. So we'll see how all of that plays out as well.
Some more questions. Just down at the front here, please, Dylan.
Thank you. So I've followed with interest the electoral situation. I'm thinking most obviously of Canada and of France, where we see in Canada mainstream centre-right party, and in France the populist right-wing party doing very well with young people. In France we have this crazy situation where Macron is the president of the boomers, and Le Pen is now emulate Le Pen, but something is going on which seems to be the inverse of what we are told in this country, that young people are all drifting left liberal, and it's in some sense inevitable that that's the case, and the only question is whether they naturally age into. So do we know, I really just don't know the answer to this. I don't know enough about French or Canadian politics. Really, does anyone on the panel know what's going on in these countries? What are these parties doing that's had this fascinating effect that contrasts so much, and can we learn something from that?
Sam.
Happy to give it a go. Look, I think there are two concurrent trends happening, one in the Anglosphere and one in continental Europe. So in continental Europe, what we've seen is a growth in support amongst young people for populist right parties. These are not, as it were, conservative parties, small c. The French young people are not backing Les Républicains, they're backing Le Pen. That is essentially, I think, a feature of more proportional electoral systems in which multiple different parties can be the alternative. And so it's the same, I think, anti-system urge that drives people to the left in this country, is you say, well, actually I'm French, I've got two options for being anti-system. It's not just Le Pen that does well with young people, it's Mélenchon, the socialist. And you see this in the Netherlands, Geert Wilders does very well with young people. There was an Austrian election on Sunday. They did very well with young people, but so did the radical left. What we've seen in the Anglosphere is, Canada's a great example. I think the better example is New Zealand, where actually they've won, centre-right has won, and it won with a majority of the young vote, promising essentially the kind of thing that we've been talking about here, a return to risk appetite, to building things, housing as a kind of a microcosm policy for that. But the new Kiwi government has been very aggressive in its commitment to planning reform, to building. Christopher Bishop, former ASI man, has deregulated the housing market in that country, certainly worked with the previous Labour government to push through some reforms in Auckland, and has begun a planning system review, which I think is due to be published at the end of the year. Pierre Poilievre in Canada, what does he talk about? It's housing all the time, but couched within that broader narrative about stakeholder capitalism, about personal opportunity, appetite for risk. Let's remember, though, they've had a Liberal government for a number of years now, a deeply unpopular Liberal government. Can't necessarily replicate that overnight, but we can certainly start to take some of the lessons.
If I can just add to that, I completely agree. And I think what's interesting, is sort of a more radical example of this, is Argentina. Javier Milei was elected with such a huge number of young people enthusiastically supporting him and supporting his rather radical agenda. And I think it's just another really, really good example of that. I think Canada's excellent because, again, the Conservative Party have been talking so vociferously about housing. But in Argentina, we see a significantly more radical shift towards free markets and towards a pro-capitalist perspective. And young people have, in their hundreds of thousands, supported Javier Milei and his agenda. And it's certainly one of the most radical shifts towards that kind of perspective that we've seen, I think, across the entire world.
Any more questions? Just this chap over here, thank you. In there.
Hi. In 2010, David Willits, now Lord Willits, wrote an excellent book called The Pinch, and the subtitle is how the baby boomers took their children's future and why they should give it back. Have the panel any thoughts about redistribution or other policies? I just heard James Cleverly talking about abolishing stamp duty for people who are downsizing, particularly at that sort of final stage in their home ownership life. Are there any other thoughts that the panel have as to how there can be that redistribution, which is obviously possibly a dangerous word with a Conservative Party?
Can I just jump in? I think that, I think redistribution is probably the wrong word in that respect. We're not physically, forcibly taking any kind of asset from older people and giving it to young people. The abolition of stamp duty would really help. I think one point we've got to make, and actually maybe this goes to Poppy's point about how we actually get members of Parliament to be able to convince people in their constituencies. Actually, that if we solve the housing crisis, the housing crisis affects last-time buyers just as much as it affects first-time buyers, right? If you're an older person and your family have left home, your children have left, they've moved on with their lives, and you're in a nice big family home, but actually it's not really appropriate for your lifestyle, and what you want is a smaller, more appropriate home, you again are disincentivised from being able to sell that home and being able to downsize because of things like stamp duty, which completely gum up the housing market. But at the same time, if there was more appropriate housing for older people, for last-time buyers, actually that would also free up that house for another new, younger family. So it's not necessarily about redistribution in the way that we're forcibly taking anything from anybody, but it's about actually allowing and incentivising those people. And actually, I think that much of that core Conservative vote, older people, those pensioners that do want to live in nicer, more appropriate housing before they leave this earth. I actually think that ultimately that's a better way to convince them. They also probably want their children and grandchildren to live in nice housing and be able to have families. So I think convincing them in that respect, looking at their children, their grandchildren, those generations, but also ultimately convincing them that the housing crisis being solved also benefits them.
I think we've got time for about 2 more brief questions. This lady here, thank you, Dylan.
Thank you. I like the idea of the younger generation wanting us to listen to them. I think also we need to go to the places where they talk and sort of go out to where they are, which is probably social media. And I thought that would be a really great place to have conversations and gather all of their views. Do you agree?
Ruth, do you have any thoughts on that? Forums for young people, where are they?
Yes, I would agree. I think social media is a great place. I mean, it's changing as well. There's been some interesting conversations about that as a medium for communicating and kind of engaging. It has a tendency to get quite sort of combative. So I guess one of the kind of themes that came out, which is no surprise to anyone, is that the sort of the scene of sort of sight of politicians sort of shouting at each other, or people debating issues by insulting each other, and is not particularly edifying for young people, nor is it really
for anyone. I don't. Yes, yeah.
So I think that question about how do you create sort of dialogue, how do you help people understand, how do you kind of explore different kind of ideas and concepts is really important. I mean, we had some of our DV youth ambassadors here at conference this week, and the same at kind of Labour and the Lib Dems. They're really interested. They love listening to all of the conversations and debates. A lot of the conversations they were having were around, why don't we get to talk about this at school? Where's our politics education? Where's our but I think, space essentially to have conversations around kind of what do people need and what are the trade-offs potentially around that. And that intergenerational equity, I think, is going to be an increasingly important theme. We know that the wealth transfer essentially that's going to take place between the sort of boomer generation and some of the next generation, but not all, is going to kind of, continue some of this in sort of financial inequity. So I think it's something that kind of definitely needs politicians to put their heads together and think about.
And also, I think social media incentivizes sound bites and very, very quick arguments that don't necessarily get down to the detail of it. Of course, we should all check out the IA's TikTok, which I launched last year. But ultimately, social media platforms do incentivize that. I think what we need is more in-depth conversations. I think just going back to what you said, I think also that those kind of arguments end up being, in a way, kind of very American, and that they become very, very combative. What we need is broader conversations, and social media isn't always the most conducive for that. I think that we, as people that are in the public, so trying to talk about these ideas, need to ensure that we are looking at those details and actually talking about those arguments in the most effective way.
And sadly, that brings us to a close now. I'm sorry about that. Thank you all so much for joining us, and if you'd all join me in thanking the panel one more time.